Hello and welcome to this third lesson in our 6-lesson series entitled A Charge to Keep. In these 6 lessons we are looking at the little book from the New Testament that we call 1 Timothy, the letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. This particular lesson will come from chapter 3, looking at the first 16 verses of chapter 3. Let's get a little background. Remember, we've established before, Paul, on his 4th missionary trip, after having been released from custody in Rome, gone home, making a 4th trip, a trip that we don't have any record of, but we draw references from some of the writings, and tradition says that he made a 4th trip going back across the continent of Turkey, or the subcontinent of Turkey, reaching the very western end, the city of Ephesus. Traveling with him was his longtime companion, Timothy. Upon leaving Ephesus, Paul asks Timothy to stay while Paul goes across the Aegean Sea back over into Macedonia. Once he reaches over into Macedonia, to the city of Philippi, he then writes a letter back to Timothy with these instructions. And this is the letter that we refer to as 1 Timothy. Now, he's giving instructions to Timothy because he left Timothy there specifically to deal with issues in the church. Now remember, Paul had preached in Ephesus for 3 years on a prior missionary trip, and had established a church there that was made up of both Gentiles and Jews. Now, in the first chapter, that first lesson, Paul was writing to Timothy to tell him to be sure to command these false teachers to stop teaching these false doctrines. And we talked about the fact there was heresy already beginning to grow in the church, both from the Greeks and the Jews. Paul gives him instructions on dealing with other issues in the church. And we talked about last week about prayer and about the modest dress of women and that type of thing. Today, he's going to give specific instructions in chapter 3 regarding who should be a leader. And in doing so, he is basically describing what Christian lifestyle should look like. And so we look today to Paul's instructions to Timothy, and specifically start with talking about church leadership. Now, as of the time Paul is writing, there is not an organized structure known as the church. They didn't have a church building. They were worshiping in homes, and they didn't have a real structure, a real hierarchy of officers. Now, there are words that are used in the writings of Paul to refer to those who are leaders, but they we should be careful to understand that they're not talking about them in the same sense of a hierarchical office as we would use the same terms today. Specifically, there are 2 Greek words that were used to refer to leaders. One of them is presbyteros. It's often translated as the word elder. The other is episkopos, which is often translated as bishop. And we'll see that this word episkopos can also be translated as overseer. Now, again, we have elders in the church, we have bishops in the church, we have other offices that are named in the church today, but he's not talking about people who are assigned a particular office, but these are leaders. These are people who are taking roles of leadership, and he's talking about those who are to be followed, those who are asserting themselves as leaders. These are the qualifications that they should have. They should be role models, and by implication, that means the other members of the church should likewise be living out these same characteristics. So with that background, let's begin in chapter 3, verse 1. Paul begins with, "Here is another trustworthy saying." Remember, previously we've seen him give a trustworthy saying, and I told you that he frequently does this in his writings. So he begins with another one of these. "Here is a trustworthy saying." This is something, a little sound bite that you can count on. "Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task." Now that's that word episkopos. Now, he's not necessarily talking about just a bishop in the sense that we know. He's talking about an overseer, a leader, one who would have some oversight, give some direction to. So he says, whoever aspires to be an overseer, whoever wants to be a leader, that's a noble purpose. That is a noble task. That is something that is worthy, a worthy aspiration. Now, the word episkopos comes from two Greek words. One Greek word, epi, means over, and scopus means to a watcher. So one who watches over. That's why we call them an overseer, later to be translated as bishop. But the one who is going to be a leader in the church, is going to give instructions, who is going to be publicly visible. Here are that for them to aspire to be that is a noble task. That is something worthwhile. It is a very, very desirable task. Now, he says, but now the overseer is to be, and now he's going to give a list of characteristics. Some of them are in the positive, some of them are in the negative. In other words, character traits, qualities of life, should be things you should see in their actions as well as what they say. So he starts off. Now the overseer is to be above reproach. Above reproach. That's where the NIV translates that word. In the King James, 1611, they translated that Greek word to say blameless, to be above reproach, to be blameless. The Greek word literally means not open to attack. That is, he's living a lifestyle that is not subject to question as to his faith, as to his application of his faith, as living out of his faith. He should be one who people see as being the real thing, should be above reproach. The second quality, he is to be above reproach. He is to be faithful to his wife. Now, the NIV translates it that way. The King James translates that as the husband of one wife, and the New American Standard Bible translates it husband of one wife. Now, this raises all kinds of questions. The Greek wording, the Greek language, literally does mean the husband of one wife. Some people even translate it means married only once. Now, we can sit around and talk about what does that mean. Does that mean that he is to be, is this requiring him to be married? For an overseer to be an overseer, does he have to be married? Is that what Paul's saying? Is he saying that if he is married and divorced and remarries, he's not qualified? Is he saying that if he's married and his wife dies, that he's not to remarry? There are all kinds of ways this could be understood. Now, divorce was a major problem in that day and time. Divorce was something that was easy amongst the Jews. Now remember, the Jewish male had all the rights. The woman couldn't divorce the husband, but the husband could divorce the woman for any reason that he found her unacceptable, and all he needed was two witnesses and to tell her she was divorced. Under the Roman law, the woman had no rights. Let me just tell you how rampant divorce was in the Roman culture. Julius Caesar, and Antony both had 4 wives. Pompey, a Roman general, he had 5 wives. Herod had 9 wives. Nero was the 3rd husband of one wife, but he had another wife, and he was her 5th husband. So divorce was a major issue in that culture, and it seems to be Paul is saying that you don't divorce. Now, it also means you are to be faithful to your wife, meaning that you do not commit adultery. Many in that culture, it was very proper, very okay for a man to be married and then to have several mistresses. So the overseer of the church is going to be different than the culture as far as his faithfulness to his wife. Um, the the next trait, besides being above reproach, faithful to his wife, he is to be temperate. Temperate. Um, temperate can mean a couple of things. One, it can mean your disposition. That is, you are not given to extremes. You are not given to always be out on the extreme. But it also can refer to your the way you approach drinking alcohol. Now, the NIV translates it temperate. The King James Version translates the Greek word as sober, and it means to be watchful and vigilant. It included, though, the opposite, sober being the opposite of drunk. Drinking, heavy drinking. Now, in the Greek culture, drunkenness was a shameful happening. People didn't, they shamed people who were constantly drinking to excess. But that was a real temptation. That was a real danger for people of that day. And so Paul is saying that the um, overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to one wife, faithful to his wife, temperate, not given to extremes, especially not given to extreme drinking. And then he is to be self-controlled. He is to, in the NIV, self-controlled. In the King James, he says he is to be of good behavior. That is, he is one who is thoughtful, who is prudent. He thinks about what he's going to do. He doesn't just fly off the handle. He's self-controlled. It can also be translated of a sound mind, discreet, having complete control over his sensual desires. So he's to be self-controlled. And then Paul says he is to be respectable. That is, to be honored and admired by other people. People see that he is different. And then Paul says he is to be hospitable. Now, technically, the Greek word, means to love a stranger. Now, you have to understand the culture of that day. In that day and time, the public inns were a terrible place to stay. If you were traveling and visiting a town, if you didn't have someone to put you up and you had to stay in an inn, it was a very undesirable place to stay. So, especially as evangelists, as teachers, as fellow Christians would come into the city, the overseer would be one who should be willing to open his home and allow that person to stay with him, to show hospitality so that they didn't have to stay in the inn. Now, that's an inconvenience. But remember, the overseer is beyond self. It's not all about me. And so he is to be hospitable. Then he is also to be able to teach. Now, the other traits that we've listed are all character traits. Now he's talking about a skill set. The overseer should be one who is able to teach. If he's going to be a leader, especially if he's got a lot of new Christians, especially if these new Christians are being subjected to these false teachings, as we talked about in chapter 1, the overseer needs to be able to teach these new Christians the faith, how to live the faith, and be committed to the faith. This was especially true in the church in Ephesus. Now, having given these positive characteristics, Paul then goes into the negatives. He said he should not be given to drunkenness. This would go back and pick up on the idea of the temperate, not given to drunkenness. That's the NIV. The NSAB, the New American Standard Bible, translates it, not overindulging in wine. And the King James says, not given to wine. So this is specifically referring to drinking. where temperate might refer to extremes or extreme in drinking, this is specifically addressing it. Again, in that world, and that drinking was a real temptation. And of course, what comes from drinking too much is you get into quarrels and disputes and that type of thing, which has no place in the church. So he's saying an overseer should not be given to drunkenness. And then he goes on to say they should not be violent. Anger. Usually you get angry when you don't get your way. Paul is saying you get beyond self. The overseer is beyond self. He said he should not be violent. But, as the opposite, the positive side, he should be gentle. Now, the Greek word for gentle there is a very difficult word to translate. Technically, it means that which corrects justice and is better than justice. Or another writer says, it means the retreating from the letter of the law to do what's right. In other words, when the law says this should happen, but it's going to result in an unjust result, you ignore the law and do what's right. That's the idea of being gentle. To look at the intention and not the act. A gentle person is one who, when somebody abuses them, they look to their intention and not to the act itself. They treat others with kindness, with love, with respect. That's what we expect of someone who is gentle. So Paul says you're not to be violent, but instead you're to be gentle. And you're not to be quarrelsome. The New American Standard Bible says not contentious. The idea is you're not always going to be arguing with people. You're going to be willing to accept. You're going to be gentle, forgiving, patient. This is the overseer. And then he says the next negative thing he should not do is not a lover of money. The King James translates it, not greedy of filthy lucre. The New American Standard Bible says, free from the love of money, not covetous. In other words, you are not to be motivated by material things. Your motivation, your intent is not focused on wealth or money. You see value in things beyond money. You see value, you see eternal values. You see value in things other than money. So these are the characteristics of the overseer, that list of positive characteristics of their character. Then he says these are things you should not do. Now he comes back and talks positive again about the overseer, and he's talking about his lifestyle. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. Okay? Manage his family well. Now, the word we translate as family in the NIV technically means household. And in fact, a household in that day and time was not only children, but also the servants and the slaves. So he should manage his affairs of his whole household properly. He should have the proper leadership of his household. And a manifestation of that is that his children would be well behaved. His children would obey him. And he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. That is, his children not only obey him because they're afraid of him, but they obey him because they respect him. He's earned the respect of it. Same way with his servants, same way with his slaves. People respect him. And of course, that respect requires that you treat people out of this lifestyle of love and compassion, of forgiveness. So he says, parenthetically, he says, if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? The idea is you demonstrate in your family relationship the type of leader you would be. If you can't manage your family, you shouldn't be an overseer managing God's family. So he says, these are the positive traits. These are the characteristics: able to teach, manage his family. And then he goes on to say, he must not be a recent convert. The overseer should be one who has grown in the faith. He should not be, as the King James said, a novice. The word technically means, the Greek word technically means newly planted. He should not be one and put in position of leadership until he has sunk his roots and has grown in his faith. New converts may be bold, but they also may be impetuous. Also, the idea that a new convert who is suddenly given role of leadership might get proud. Pride might step in. So he says you shouldn't push this type of leadership on new converts, lest they be deceived and lest they fall. He says he must not be a recent convert, or if you use a recent convert, he may become conceited and fall into the same judgments as the devil. Pride, self, all about me. So he says, these are the characteristics. Then he goes on to add, he must also have a good reputation with outsiders. Those who are not a part of the family, those who do not share in the faith, they should likewise respect this person if he is going to be a leader. He should have a good reputation with the outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. That way he would not be given to pride or hypocrisy. That, I suggest to you, is what he means by the devil's trap, pride and hypocrisy. He should have a good reputation. People should come to expect a lifestyle out of him. He has developed a reputation for that lifestyle, and they should expect no less, even those outside the church. Well, that's what he's talking about, the overseer. Then he comes and starts, he changes the topic to the deacons. Now, it's interesting to think about who the deacons are. Who were the deacons? In Acts chapter 6, Luke tells us of the 12, the disciples, appointing deacons for the purpose of serving. And that's what the word deacon means, to serve. In that particular case, remember there was complaints about the Gentile widows not receiving the same amount of support from the church. And so rather than the disciples having to get in and handle all these type of decisions, they reserved themselves for spiritual matters, and they appointed 6 to serve the compassion, to serve the physical needs of the people as the church would minister to the poor and the needy. And they called these deacons. Well, the early church adopted the role of the deacon from the Jewish faith. The Jews had a very organized system of caring for the poor. That's one of the distinctions always of Judaism, is they were called upon to care for the poor. And what they would have is they would have a group of people who were designated to go around and go to the homes of individual Jews, individual members, if you will, and collect from them a contribution that they would then put together, and then these same people would go out and distribute it to the poor, to those who had need. And they would distribute it under certain conditions. One condition is they would give them enough food for 14 meals. That would be 2 meals a day for 7 days. That's the amount they would give them. This is what the role of the deacon. Well, the early church adopted that, and they had those in their numbers, besides the overseers, they had those in their numbers who were serving, who were involved in the ministry, what we call the compassionate ministry, serving others, okay? These are the deacons. And now he's going to talk about the qualifications to be a deacon. He's gone through a list of positives and negatives regarding the overseers. Now he says, in the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, not pursuing dishonest gain. Very, very similar to the list that we had in the overseer. Worthy of respect. That would be basically a summary of all those attributes of the overseer. He should be sincere, the NIV says. The New American Standard Version, a Bible, translates that Greek word as not insincere, a double negative, not insincere, sincere, no hypocrisy. He is not, the King James says not double-tongued. Double-tongued would be the opposite of sincere. That is, saying one thing to one person, saying something else to another person. You could see as a deacon is going from home to home, he tells one story to one person, another story. That's not going to work out. He's going to be sincere. That is the same story, consistent, if you will. It's interesting that this term was not used in reference to the overseer, but it is used in reference to the deacon, because the deacon is going to have contact with all these different people, and he said you need to be sincere. One writer says this: a deacon in his going from house to house and in his dealing with those who needed charity had to be a straight man. Again and again he would be tempted to evade issues by a little timely hypocrisy and smooth speaking. He's going to approach issues. He's not going to double talk. He's not going to be double tongued. He's going to be sincere, straightforward, consistent. The next characteristic of the deacon is not indulging in much wine. Again, this wine issue was a real problem, a real temptation in that culture. And again, he said he is not to be indulging in much wine. And then he says, not pursuing dishonest gain. Again, not greedy, not focused on money, but rather he has values beyond money. Verse 9, they must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. Now, when we get down to verse 16, Paul is going to define this truth, the deep, the essence of the faith. He says they are to keep hold of the deep truths of the faith. Now, Paul will define that in verse 16 as the mystery of godliness. But he says they are to understand and live it out and apply it. And we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But they are to put it into practice. They must hold on to the faith. The deacon must do so with a clear conscience. If he has sin in his life, his conscience is not clear. He must live the life that he teaches, that he professes. He must grasp the truth, commit to the truth, and apply the truth. Live out the ramifications of this mystery of grace. The deacon is going to be that person who is having contact with folks who need to see that lived out. So he says he must hold to the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They, speaking of the deacons, must first be tested, and then, if there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. Now, we're not sure exactly what the testing means. It may have meant a period of probation, but there should be some examination. We should hear what they say they believe. We should watch how they live and act and whether their lifestyle is consistent with what they say and believe. And like I said, maybe even a period of probation. But they should be tested. Then, once they have shown, once you have seen that they have these characteristics, then they may serve as deacons. Verse 11, in the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, etc., etc. Let's stop, first of all, talking about what does he mean, the women. In the same way, the women. Now, the Greek word that's translated women, like the word for male can be male or husbands, could be translated female or wives. Now, question. Is he talking about the wives of the deacons? Or is he talking about females who are also serving as deacons, i.e. a deaconess? Now, we know that there were deaconesses in the early church from other writings. So Paul seemingly is saying, because remember we have this dispute. Some want to read Paul to say that women could not take roles of leadership. This seems to be suggesting that there were women deacons who were taking roles of service, and these are the characteristics we should expect of them. And it's in the same way, much the same way as he talks about the deacon. In the same way, the women, whether the wives of the deacon or the female deaconesses, are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. Again, he's talking about this lifestyle, talking about their characteristics. They're to be worthy of respect. Now, you need to put this into context. In the Greek world, in the Greek culture, the proper female lived a very isolated life. She was never in public with men. She didn't even eat at the same dinner table with her husband. She lived in a secluded chambers that only her husband could go into. She was not even to be mentioned by name by the family. Okay? She lived a very, very secluded life. Now, in that culture, the females in the Christian church have, we would use the term, been liberated. They're not only involved in the church, they are here given roles of leadership in the church. And that would be so countercultural. They would stand out. And of course, when a person is standing out in the public and visible, the first thing that the world does is try to find fault with them. Try to find some place where they are inconsistent, some place where they're not living out what they say they believe. So Paul starts off and says that the women, the deaconesses, should be worthy of respect. Even in their liberated status, they're living a life that even the outside world could not find fault with. They had to respect them beyond question. And then he says they should not be malicious talkers, gossip. Now, just think about it. If there were certain types of needs that the female deaconess would be able to handle. Okay, think about the widows. The widows who needed some compassionate ministry expressed to them, whether it be food or other type of assistance. The female deaconess would be in a far better position to understand the needs of this widow than would a male. So this would give them the opportunity of having a role to do a better job than the male would do. Now, as these female deaconesses are talking to different people, they're learning things about them. The temptation in the human is to go out and start telling everybody else this person's business. He says, no. You're not to gossip. He calls that malicious talking. You're not to spread stories. You're not to spread rumors. They are to be very, very circumspect in their conversation, not malicious talkers. And they're to be temperate. And I'd suggest to you we can take this word temperate here in both capacities as we did before. That is, not given to extremes in their acts and their passions, but also not drinking to excess. And then, besides being tempered, he says they are to be trustworthy in everything. Trustworthy. They should have personal integrity. They should be dependable. People, even on the outside, who see these women asserting themselves in roles that a proper Greek woman wouldn't do, they respect them. They respect them because of their integrity. They respect them because of their consistency. Their lifestyle lives out the love of Christ that they preach and say they place their faith in. So he's talked about the qualifications of the female, the deaconess. Then he comes back to the deacon. He comes back to talk about the deacon regarding his family life. And he says the deacon, like the overseer, must be faithful to his wife. Again, all those things were raised before. faithful to his wife, meaning not having a mistress, meaning not divorcing her, meaning not remarrying after she dies. We don't know for sure exactly, but he's clearly in that culture. He is saying he is to be faithful to his wife, which would be total countercultural. He's not having a mistress. He's not having affairs. He's not divorcing one wife and marrying a new one on a regular basis. He's different than that. This is the deacon, like the overseer. He is to be faithful to his wife, and he is to manage his children and his household well, just like we saw before. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. He says, these overseers, these deacons, these deaconesses, these who serve, when they serve well, when they're living the life and promoting the gospel out of sincerity, they serve well, two things happen. One is external. That is, they have an excellent standing. People inside the church and outside the church respect them. There is that external reputation that comes because they aren't given to passion. They aren't given to gossip. They aren't given to anger. They aren't given to excessive drinking. They're different. They're different. And in that also, there's an internal result. He says, not only do they have an excellent standing externally, but they have great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. As they serve, their faith grows. As they serve, their roots sink. Their assurance in Christ, in their faith, grows as a result of their service. So Paul has given this description to Timothy and saying, as you are working with these people, these are the attributes you should urge upon those who are leading, whether they be an overseer, a deacon, or a deaconess. But he's also going to show us that these are attributes for all, because he says, on a personal note, I intended to come see you. I had hoped to come see you, although I hope to come to you soon. He says impliedly, there seems to be some possibility, some suggestion I may not be able to. He says, although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, the suggestion is there is the possibility that he's going to be delayed. So he says, if I am delayed, I want you to have this instruction. If I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. He says, I want to give you these instructions so you can start teaching them how they should behave in the household. Now, some have said this is talking about in the corporate worship, but the idea of household is talking about God's family, living in God's family, whether it's in the church on Sunday or with family and friends and others during the week in God's household. God's household is made up. Now remember, the word household is the father with his children, his wife, his slaves, his servants. It's the whole bunch. God's household are those who are friends of God and friends of each other because of that friendship with God. They have that common belief. So he says, I want you to be sure to teach them how they ought to conduct themselves. Conduct themselves is not just talking about the conduct of life between 11 and 12 on Sunday morning in the church, but he's talking about your conduct of life in the household, in the family. I want the people to understand how they ought to conduct themselves in God's household. And he says God's household is the church, the collection of believers. Now, he says that the church of the living God. Now, he points out living God because remember, many of the people that in Ephesus were worshiping the gods that weren't living, Artemis, Diana, the other Roman gods. He says, the living God, the church of the living God, the believers in the living God. This is God's household. And he says, This church, this group of believers, they are the pillar and foundation of the truth. They are the pillar and foundation of the truth. And we're going to come back and define truth in the next verse. But let's talk about this idea of pillar and foundation. Interesting terms. He says they are the pillar of the truth. Now we think of a pillar in the terms of support, but the people in Ephesus would hear the word pillar and understand it a little differently, because in Ephesus they knew about specific pillars. Let me read this commentary to you. It says, in Ephesus, to which these letters were written, the word pillar would have a special significance. The greatest glory of Ephesus was the temple of Diana, or Artemis. Great is Diana of Ephesus, Acts 19:28. That's what the people cried out. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world. One of its features was its pillars. It contained 127 pillars, every one of them a gift of a king. All were made of marble, and some were studded with jewels and overlaid with gold. The people of Ephesus knew well how beautiful a thing a pillar could be. It may well be that the idea of the word pillar here is not so much support, that is contained in buttress, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as display. Often the statue of a famous man is set on top of a pillar that it may stand out above all ordinary things and so be clearly seen, even from a distance. The idea here is that the church's duty is to uphold the truth in such a way that all men may see it. So he says the church is the pillar of truth. The Greek word church, ecclesia, means the ones who have assembled because they've been called out. God has called them out. They're to be different. They have assembled themselves as the household of God. And now they should live out the truth so that it will be seen by all people. The pillar of truth. But he also says the church is the foundation of truth. The word foundation also is translated as buttress. And the New American Standard calls it the support of the truth. The King James says the ground of truth. What we're talking about is the idea of support. It's upholding. The buttress or the foundation is that which the building rests on, and it keeps the building standing upright and intact. And he says that the church is the foundation, the buttress of the truth. It upholds the truth so that others can see it, pillar, and it upholds it such that people see its stability, its permanence. Okay? That's the church, the pillar and foundation of the truth. And now he defines the truth. And in doing so, he's probably quoting from a hymn or a poem. He says, beyond all question, and then he breaks into this poem. The mystery from which true godliness springs is great. This is the truth. Now he's going to define the truth by the use of this song. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, and was taken up to glory. This is obviously a reference to the ministry of Jesus Christ. This is talking about Jesus coming. And he starts it by saying he appeared in the flesh. He is very God, but he appeared in the flesh. Contradicting those heretics that said Jesus wasn't a man, he was very human. He appeared in the flesh. His earthly ministry, the humanity of Christ. He was vindicated by the Spirit. His mission, his teachings were proven to be true by the Spirit. He healed people. He fed 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread. He raised people from the dead. And his resurrection. All of these are vindications proving the truth of what he was saying. He was seen by angels. Angels announced his birth. It was the angels who told the ladies at the tomb of his resurrection. And he was seen by angels. He was preached among the nations. The story of his birth, the story of his death, the story of his resurrection by Paul's time had been preached throughout the known world. Remember when Stephen was stoned, the 12 disciples spread and they went to far corners of the earth preaching the gospel, carrying the word to tell believers about this Jesus, the truth. He not only was preached among the nations, but he was believed on by the world. Now, the word nations, when it says he was preached among the nations, the word nations also carries with it a very definite meaning of Gentiles. He was preached amongst the Gentiles. And now, the final part is, and the world believed, the Gentiles believed, as many here in Ephesus had. This is the essence. And then it says he was taken up in glory. That's the ascension. The story of Jesus' birth, ministry, death, resurrection, that this is the essence of the gospel. This is the truth that is to be preached. And of course, as you preach the truth, you talk about Jesus' ministry, you're talking about his love, his grace, his compassion, his forgiveness, and how those who follow him are to live a similar lifestyle. So the role of the church is to uphold this truth, foundation, but also to show this truth, the pillar. That's the role of the church. So now, as Paul has seemingly started off by talking about personal characteristics of those who would lead, overseers, deacons, and deaconesses, it's not just those folks. These folks are to be the role models. If they're the leaders, they are the one that the others should be patterning their lives after. But the role of the church is to be the pillar and the buttress of the truth. The lifestyle should so of the church, of individual members of the church, as they live amongst each other and as they interact with those on the outside, should be such that outsiders as well as those in the church would say, yes, that is a committed person. That is the lifestyle. So the question we have to ask after we read this kind of a lesson, how do I measure up? How do I measure up as a pillar of the truth, demonstrating living the life of the truth? How do I live up as a matter of one upholding the truth? That's the call Paul has placed on the people in Ephesus. That's the call he's asked Timothy to teach them to respond to. Remember, God does not call us, but that he will also equip us and enable us. So our prayer this week is that we might be the pillar to show the truth and the foundation, the buttress to uphold the truth. But that we do so not in our own strength, because that would be very contradictory to all that Paul said, but rather it is in our obedience to Christ and his enabling us and equipping us that we can be that pillar and that buttress to a world that needs to see the truth. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for your word and the instruction it gives us. We pray now that even this week, as we think about these terms, as we think about these characteristics, as we see our lives, may we be that individual. May we be that person beyond reproach. May we be that sincere person. May we avoid those negative traits. But above all, may we be the pillar of the truth, the buttress of the truth, so that this world might see, know, and accept the truth. For it's in the name of the one, the truth, Jesus the Christ, that we pray. Amen. Thank you.